Okay, so hard ground etching basically involves taking a piece of copper that's perfectly clean and you put a acid resistant coating on top of it. So if we took our copper with the acid resistant coating on it and we dunked it in a vat of acid, nothing would happen to it. Basically, the hard ground would protect the acid and no chemical reactions would happen, nothing would be biting. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that copper plate, and if we're looking at it in cross section here, all right, we have our copper plate, with our nicely 45-degree angled sort of bevel on it, and then we're going to cover it with some acid-resistant coating, in this case a hard ground, right? So we're going to do this. This is all protects acid, so when the acid tries to bite, nothing happens. It can't get through. What we're going to do is if we're looking at the plate this way, we're going to scratch lines through that hard ground. So if I'm drawing marks like this on a copper plate, it's scratching little lines through my acid-resistant coating. And so now when the acid goes in there, it's got a little opening, right? It's going to go in and it's going to attack the copper and it's going to start to bite down into that copper plate. So the longer that I leave my copper plate in the acid, the deeper that bite's going to go. So a very dark, super thick black line is going to take me a good hour and a half, and a really fine sort of, light little line is probably going to be more like 10 minutes. So what happens is the acid has gone in and it's etched or bit down into the plate and all of those, for all those spots, and then when I take this acid-resistant coating off, when I take the hard ground off, I'm left with a plate that has a whole bunch of little indentations in it, right? So little pits, grooves, little divots in it where ink can collect when I go to wipe it up. And that's why they call etching, sometimes it's referred to as intaglio, which means little incised lines. So basically we're trying to put little tiny pits and etched lines down into a copper plate that'll then print. So what we'll do after we've done our etching, after we've done our line work, after we've drawn what we wanted to and etched it as long as we want, then we're going to go ahead and take our plate and we're going to put it, again looking at it from the side here, we're going to put it in a vat of acid, but the acid's in a big tank that looks something like this, right? And so the acid is ferric chloride, and ferric chloride is actually a very strong salt. So it's not it doesn't sort of eat into the plate, it actually rusts the plate. So what ends up happening is every place where I have an open spot in my copper is gonna rust. And so the rust is gonna build up, and when it's in a vertical tank like this, it's gonna drop down to the bottom of the tank. If I etched my plate flat like this and the ferric chloride was over the top of it, basically the rust would eventually build up and it would stop the reaction of biting down into the plate. So the vertical tank means that all of the ferric chloride sort of produced rusty particles are going to drop to the bottom of the tank, and it's going to fall down here, and we're going to so it's all going to fall into the tank. So you want to put a little piece of tape on the back side of this and then tape it around to hold it onto the tank, which I'll show you how to do here after we're done. So that's the basic principle of how etching works, is that we have copper plate, acid resistant coating, and the acid bites everything that's not covered by that acid resistant coating and drops it down a level where the ink will hold and stay. So I'll explain more about that as we go. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about for intaglio is dry techniques. And so if we have our copper plate here with these lines that are etched in, so if you can see, it's a lovely, lovely little etching of a dog. If you can see it, the lines are etched down in there. And so if I'm looking at my plate in cross section right now, what I have is I have some marks like this that are down in the plate. And when I go to print this, I'm going to wipe ink over the whole surface of the entire plate, right? So the ink is going to go everywhere and it's going to get down into these low spots in the bottom, in the lower divots. And then I'm going to wipe it off with a tarlatan, and it's going to end up, the ink is just going to stay down in those low places. And that's going to end up getting run through the press and offset. So that's a traditional line etching, or intaglio. So that's what this plate would be. But sometimes when you get to this point, you realize your plate isn't quite dark enough, you've missed a few lines, and rather than go all the way back and hard ground your plate and re-etch it, which you can certainly do, another technique that you can use is called dry techniques or dry point. And dry point, basically, if we're looking at the surface of our plate again, is basically just scratching or scuffing the plate. So you're raising a tooth that will hold ink just by scraping or scuffing up or messing with that plate. So you're going to try and grunge up the plate, basically, if you will. So you take a sharp object, it can be really anything at all, and you just scratch the plate. And what ends up happening is there's a little divot that gets made, kind of like this, but just not much when you scratch a plate. But what you do is you kick up kind of a burr. All right, so you get a little bit of a, I'll draw that a little bigger, so you get a little bit of a burr that gets kind of kicked up by the scraping and scratching. It's a little bit like a plow, right? I know, again, we're back to farming, analogies again, but it's like a plow that goes through the earth, and when you're plowing or digging, it ends up kicking up sort of a trough on either side of that hole, that V-shaped hole that you're trying to gouge into the earth. And it's a lot like that with the copper. So what ends up happening now is that when we wipe ink all over the surface of this plate, the copper kind of collects underneath and around this dry point mark. And you end up with a really fuzzy, sort of rich, kind of velvety line, as opposed to the really clean, straight, usually very meticulous kind of etch line. So you get a whole different flavor of line. But there's a lot of different tools you can etch with. Linear tools, such as just your etching needle, sharpen it up really well, and then just scratch the heck out of the plate. You can use like nails, any dental tools, anything like that you can think of. But you can also use what's called a roulette. And a roulette will go in and just kick up a whole bunch of little tiny burrs all over the plate. That'll end up creating kind of a tonal area. You can also use what's called a diamond tip scribe, which will really smoothly glide through there. I'll show you that here in a little while. As well as you can do different kinds of sort of linear tools that you can use to kind of run over the plate. And you're basically just trying to rough up the surface. So make these little burrs that jump up that'll end up holding ink. The last dry technique that you can use is what's called engraving, which I'll show again here in a little while. And engraving creates these sort of nice, sort of straight lines, but it's by gouging with a very sharp tool. You just push your way through physically and gouge it out of there. Really, really hard to do well and really hard to control, so most people these days don't like to do that too much. But we call these the dry techniques, so engraving, dry point, the roulettes and stuff like that. They're dry techniques because they're not wet, right? We don't put them into the acid. They don't require acid for them to work, so they're dry, if you will. Line etching and aquatint are more wet techniques because you have to throw them into the acid to get them to work. Okay, so aquatint. Aquatint is basically a halftone process kind of in reverse. And again, the first sort of techniques discovered for intaglio or line etching, they think maybe from armorers, like people who like to etch little designs into rich people's armor, stuff like that. But eventually they got tired of that, because it's a binary system of a hard line or not a mark or not a mark, and so you have to use hatching or stippling. So instead they thought, how can we make tonal things that'll happen so that we can get grays or different subtle variations in tone. And so the idea with aquatint is that it's a halftone, but it's in reverse. So if I'm looking down on my plate, right, I'm looking down on my copper plate again. If I cover my copper plate with a dot pattern of acid-resistant particles, and then I throw it in the acid, what's going to happen is each of those little particles, if this is again a cross-section up here, they're going to resist the acid. And so all around these little particles, I'm going to get, the acid's going to bite. So the longer that I leave it in, the darker and deeper the bite's going to be. So if I leave my plate in for 45 minutes, the bite will be really, really deep, kind of like this. And so I'm going to get a really deep surface and a very black, rich, velvety color. If I leave it in for only like 2 minutes, it's going to give me small, shallow bite. So that gives us a range of tone if you think of a 0 through 10 tonal scale. A 0 is basically white, and then like a 1 would be a super duper light gray, right? That's going to be a very light, thin etch in our copper plate with aquatint. So it's going to produce a gray shape, kind of a gray tone, I'm sorry. And if we go all the way over here to our 10, well, that's going to be really, really deep bite in our copper plate, and that's going to be basically black. So the longer that you leave your plate in the acid, the deeper your Aquatint bite will be, and the darker the tone, the more tooth will be brought up on the plate to hold the ink. So if you want a very dark print, you want to leave it in a long time. If you want a really light tone, you want to only put it in for a little while, or maybe even try spit bite, which is something else that I'll explain here in a little bit. So that's the principles of Aquatint. Again, acid resistant dots. And the thing to know is that if you have, if your dots are too far apart like this, there won't be enough sort of tooth on the plate. It'll just basically be all washed out with just a few little kind of valleys like this in it. And so all of this space in here where the ink is supposed to hold, it'll kind of wipe out of there and you won't get much out of it. If your dots are too tight together, so if your dots are all piled up really closely together on top of each other, your plate will end up looking like this, where you'll have just tiny little spaces in between where these dots were, because there's so many of them all over the plate, and it won't actually hold. So what we're looking for is we're looking for a 50% gray distribution of dots. So you want to try and have them be equally spaced, about half, 50% gray, halftone if you think of it that way. And that'll give us just enough space between our dots to make sure that the ink will actually hold really carefully. So when you're getting ready to do this in class, make sure you ask me before you throw it in the acid, and I'll let you know if it's 50% or if you need to add a little bit more.